a huge focus on Interbase. I've been using Interbase for years and still find that it's my go-to database. You can reach out to me with questions at mary.kelly@embarcadero.com. If you do have any questions during this webinar, please put them in the questions panel of GoToWebinar, and it's typically located on the right-hand side of your screen. We have a full agenda today where we will explore things to know before jumping into the development process of IB applications that you can use, deploying to desktop and mobile devices, along with what you should know and use when it comes to maintaining or managing your Interbase infrastructure. We'll have a live Q&A at the end where you can ask me your questions. Now, in the event you haven't heard much on Interbase before, it is a database. With its near-zero administration, small footprint, easy installation process, and flexibility, Interbase as a database software provides a fast, powerful, and reliable database engine capable of scaling users for any industry or business size. It's fully customizable to your specific needs, and it's the database that lets you focus on your business's needs and expansion. Interbase provides up to 256-bit encryption, which matches the federal regulations on personally identifiable information, and several other ways to keep users' data safe. Providing database and column-level encryption with security and user roles, you can keep access to the data private. Interbase is designed to be a low-maintenance or self-tuning database, making it great for embedded applications or areas with a small IT support team, where you can scale up to larger IT infrastructures that may not have as much time to dedicate to a database. We have a couple different editions of Interbase, and they include the Interbase Server, Desktop, To-Go, and IB Lite. We also have a free developer edition of Interbase as well. If you have multiple users and devices that need to connect to the same data, then Interbase Server is probably the best choice for your architecture. The server itself can be installed on Windows or Linux, giving you more flexibility of connecting many different types of devices to the same databases and server. This is typically the most popular of options since it's so scalable. It's based on concurrent users, so the number of users connecting to the database at the same time, not per user profile. The desktop edition has the same idea as the Interbase server, except that it's permitted to local database connections, and it's Windows only. Interbase To-Go is the option for anyone wanting to add data storage to their applications, so locally or by connecting to a remote Interbase server. So Interbase To-Go is an excellent choice for iOS, Android, Windows, Linux, and macOS applications that need to move data storage offline as well. With Interbase To-Go, you can have a standalone encrypted data storage, and it actually removes the need to install client drivers. Now, IB Lite is similar to To-Go, as they both contain the same libraries for the embeddable database engine, but it has a few restrictions, such as a database file size limit of 100 megabytes, no encryption capabilities, and also no change views. So, getting Interbase up and running. There are a few different ways to get the download for Interbase. Rad Studio includes both the Developer Edition and the IB Lite or IB To-Go licensing, depending on your version of Delphi or C++ Builder. You can download the Developer Edition, the Server Edition trial, and the To-Go Edition trials from the Embarcadero website. All you have to do is provide a valid email address so that the serial number can actually be sent to you, and be sure to check your spam folder if you don't receive it relatively quickly. Interbase comes with sample databases already. If you install Rad Studio, then you automatically get 4 databases that you can add to your server. With the Interbase instance installation, you get one database, which is the employee database. The int L database is basically the exact same as the employee database, plus you get some UDFs or user-defined functions. You also get UDFs when you install Interbase through RadStudio as well. Developing and deploying with Interbase. To get us started with this section, let's take a quick look at IB Console. The first time you log into Interbase or want to start working with Interbase, you'll want to make sure that your server manager, which starts and stops the server, is running. So once you've made sure that the server is actually running, you can exit out of the server manager and open up IB Console. And within these servers, under these icons, we'll be able to tell whether the Interbase server is actually running. You'll see an X or a check mark determining whether you're logged into the server or not. So we'll go through and log in. I'll log in using the sysdba, and then the default password for sysdba is master key, all lowercase. So we'll log into the server and we'll now see that check mark. That then allows us to open up and see all of the databases that we have listed under that server. You can very easily create or add databases as well just by right-clicking. I'll double-click on a database and that will open the connection to the database. Now from the database, I can either choose to disconnect or see several of the options available for Interbase. There are some maintenance options that you can add, or you can even view the metadata for the database, and this is just a SQL text that basically creates the entire database for you. You can see any users that are connected or also check out the properties relating to your database. So any of the options. You can choose to use embedded user authentication or disable it as well. Once you're connected to a database, if you're testing any of the sample databases, say the employee database, you'll notice that we have something called domains. Now, domains essentially allow you to define a specific field type. So in the case of address line, you can double click on it and it creates a type called varchar 30 that you now can use across the entire database. So instead of having to go in and replicate the exact same field across the database, you can just pull in a domain. So this really simplifies adding those types everywhere. And one of the great benefits of domains is that should you alter a domain, say change from a varchar 30 to perhaps a varchar 40, it will replicate across the entire database for you. You also have your tables. You can double click on the tables and not only see properties, you can also alter any of them. You can see the metadata, including table data, permissions you may have. So if you have an encrypted database, this is how you'll work with the encrypted database. If you have encryption or would like to grant role access to someone, you can easily do that. And then you can also view the data as well as dependencies for all of the tables that you have. IB Console happens to have iSQL or Interactive SQL. You can access it either by clicking on the little running man or by going to Tools and Interactive SQL. And this is where you'll be able to do the brunt of your SQL statements. So something very simple and easy, select everything from customer. You can run that query, utilize the functions, keywords. If you have stored procedures already in place in your database, you can also go and add those and select or execute upon those. For transactions, you can use the transaction editor as well. Your access mode, isolation levels, and weight resolution. You can also choose to save any of them as your default. Within IB Console, you're also given a list of all the indices if you happen to have any views set in the database or any of the stored procedures. The biggest benefit to IB Console is that you can double click on just about anything and you're able to see these properties, the metadata, permissions that might be there, dependencies, so that you can really understand what's happening in your database, so no surprises. Triggers, if you install UDFs or user-defined functions, they will show up under external functions. You can create generators. So Interbase does not have an auto increment, so you can create your own auto incremented scale from there. And in Interbase 2020 databases as well, you'll see subscriptions, which is change views, as well as table spaces, which are a great addition for managing your databases. Connecting to Interbase. You may have seen this slide if you've attended some of our other webinars recently. While Interbase developers tend to popularly choose the Embarcadero developer toolset, Delphi and C++ Builder, RAD Studio, you can still use Interbase with a variety of languages and toolsets like Visual Studio or PHP and Ruby. We also provide support for your standard interfaces like ODBC, JDBC, and our newly released ADO.NET driver that you can find on GitHub or NuGet. With Enterprise and Architect editions, you have access to FireDAC, our universal data access components. They're built on years of writing native drivers for database backends. FireDAC was built to be a powerful access layer that supports all the features that you need to build real-world, high-load applications. FireDAC provides a common API for accessing different database backends without giving up access to the unique database-specific features or having to compromise on performance. It tends to be the preferred component library for many of our customers. There are also several demos that we provide for Interbase and FireDAC specifically that you should definitely check out, including some of the samples that I'm showing here today. Now we're going to jump into my Windows VM, where we can go back through and take another little overview look at IB Console, and also take a look at an application that was designed mostly for mobile with the need to encrypt the Interbase database to deploy in an Android or a mobile application scenario. Now, the database that we're going to be working with is the column_employee database. Now, this is a copy of the employee database that is included with Delphi and Interbase. We can log into the database with the master key password and take a quick look at the tables and the employee data. Now that we're logged in, we want to encrypt our data within this database. So not only are we going to encrypt the entire database, but we're also going to choose to encrypt a specific column within the employee table. Now for the application that we're going to be working with, it's going to be an HR versus new employee application. So our HR personnel will be able to see the salaries, so they'll have permission to see the salary, while our new employees will not. Exiting out of that, we can then go back up to our column employee and choose to encrypt the database. Now the first step with the encryption wizard is to provide the password for our sysdso user and create a key. I'm going to say, and create a key. I'll say key_new. And then we also have to choose the cipher at which we want to work with. We have both AES and DES. We'll say we want AES 256-bit encryption set to random for both init vector and padding. We'll click next, and then we'll create the backup key for this, and we'll just say backup_key. And provide a password. Clicking OK. Our database is now encrypted. So now I want to go into my employee table, and I want to click on Alter and choose the salary field. Then I'm going to edit that salary field. Now, the encryption key that I'm going to use here is just the HR key, and I can choose to have a decrypt default, for instance 0 if I wanted. And now my salary field is encrypted. And since my salary field is now encrypted with the HR key, I can then go to permissions. Now, any of my users specifically that'll be here, I can then go through and create a new item. So I will give encryption permission to this specific user. So I'll say my HR employee, they have decrypt properties with grant options for the salary column. So I can click OK. So now my HR employee has access to decrypt my database. So now I'm going to show you in RAD Studio how you can use the IB2Go Encrypt application to connect to an embedded Interbase database. Now this application uses Embedded User Security, or EUA, to manage access to private data. It has password protection and also has encrypted data on device. Now this prevents anyone from being able to read off the database file. The application has those two users, the HR employee and the new employee that we saw in IB Console. We can access the staff FireDAC connection editor to see what our connection looks like. We have the driver ID set to IB, the name and path of the database, the username and password, along with the protocol. We can do the exact same thing with the FD connection for HR. We have our database, the protocol, the username and password, along with IB driver set again. We can test that connection. And we have successfully established the connection to both of our databases. Now taking a look at the queries that we're going to be running, it'll be the same query for both, but it'll be the select full name and select salary. FireDAC drivers implement the IFD-Fizz driver interface that can link, configure, and create a FireDAC virtual driver to your selected database. To connect to a local database on mobile, you need to deploy the database to the mobile device and check the configuration to see where the local file is going to be, under the Documents folder for iOS devices or internal storage for Android devices. You're also going to need both the Interbase to go required files like the license file and the other configuration files, along with the database file. You can add the IB2Go license file to your project by right-clicking the project name in the project manager and selecting Add, then navigating to the redist location and clicking Open. We now have the reg_IB2Go license file included with our application. You can add the database file by clicking Add and navigating to the location of your database and clicking Open. After adding the database file, the Featured Files window displays. Now you'll select the Interbase to go in the Featured Files, then you'll click OK to close the Featured Files dialog box. Now under the Interbase to go node, you need to select the license that you wish to deploy on the device. In this case, we'll be choosing the IB2Go license, so we can uncheck the IB Lite. At the minimum, Interbase requires that the rest of the files are present before it can deploy to a mobile device or desktop device. These are messages, licensing, DLLs, the admin.ib file, and a few others. Now, for embedded user authentication, you don't need the admin.ib file, as the names and passwords are inside the database file. But if you don't choose to use EUA or embedded user authentication, then you must have a copy of your admin.ib file in the Interbase subdirectory. We can open up the deployment manager by selecting Project Deployments and selecting the debug configuration from the drop-down list of target platforms at the top of the deployment manager, and where we can see that the database has been added to the platforms. Now we can see how the remote path to our database has been set for Windows and for the Android platform. For the remote path on the Android device platform, it is currently set to Assets Internal. As we just configured, when we run the application on the mobile device, the database file is going to be deployed to the internal storage for the Android platform. Now we'll go ahead and build our application for the Android 64-bit platform. It will compile, link, deploy, and package everything that's needed before pushing out to my Pixel 4. We start off with the info page before moving into the connections, where we connect to both the HR and new employee databases. Now looking at the HR emp user, we can see that they have the decrypt privileges to decrypt the salary of the database. Looking at the employee user now, we can also see that our employee user does not have the decrypt privileges to see the salaries of our database. So now we're going to build this application in 32-bit Windows. We can connect to the users just to show you how there are no changes that needed to be made to the database file or to the application. And all of this was done using our embedded IB2Go license. Next, I wanted to talk about change views. Now, change views is a patented technology with Interbase, and it is a subscription-based model that's used to identify what data has been changed in the database. And it lets you subscribe to that data as well. So you create a subscription that covers tables and columns, and then you either allow or give access to users to subscribe to those changes in the data. So using a change tracking system like change views gives you the ability to provide a list of changes like the inserts, updates, and deletes that you make to a database from one point in time to another. Now, subscriptions can be run both during a connection and spanning a connection. So during a connection, you can have an alert and go ahead and fetch those deltas. This is especially useful when you have to fetch thousands of records, and so you can get a message that basically says there have been changes to this table, and then you can actually use change views to get that change or get that delta instead of actually having to refresh the entire query. So the larger the query, the more change views can help. For spanning a connection, a really cool thing is that you don't actually have to be connected for it to record the changes. So once you start a database transaction, you can have a subscription set, then disconnect from your database, and then start a new connection with a new transaction at a future point in time. So from a development standpoint, implementing change views is fairly easy, and taking advantage of change views lets you focus on the rest of your development and not have to worry about how you're going to track changes, whether that be through adding a whole bunch of triggers and maybe some handling extra log files or transaction write-ahead logging, all of which can be really time-consuming and can also cause performance drawbacks. So let's take a look at change views in action. In our change views demo today, we're going to look at the generic change views application that ships with both Delphi and C++ Builder. In the past, change notification typically involved triggers, you had logging, or write-ahead transaction logs. And this was a really time-consuming process and affected the database performance for developers and for end users for specific transaction loads. Now with change views, there is no performance overhead on existing transactions that you have because it maintains a consistent view of the changed data that's observable by other transactions. Now, if we move into IB console, you can see here that I have a database called sub with a single table named tab. If I open up tab, we can see here I'm looking at an ID and a name, and I have some data points here. Now, you can also see that I have a subscription, which is a requirement for using change views, and we've created the subscription called sub on the table called tab for rows to insert, update, and delete. We have an FD connection that opens the connection to the database with this original query listing out select everything from tab, and we have a grid that then returns the contents of that table. We have a separate connection that runs to the same select all from tab query and pulls that data from the table. Now we have this EA changes, also called an event alerter, and this changes query is actually run by this event alert that automatically refreshes, so we have the most up-to-date data that's been added to the database. The change alert is then set to the delta merge, so it merges only the delta, telling it the subscription name that we had, which is sub, and then it just reports that back. Now we can run this application and open up our connection to the database. So this application will open both database connections and also the queries as well. So now we have data that's being pulled. Now if I go through and make any changes to this, so I'll use for and I'll spell out my name, we can now see that the second grid here, the query that's run by the change alert, every time that a change is then made, it refreshes the query that we have for queue changes and then allows for the data to be shown that it's been changed. Now if I go through again to my name and make a change, and we'll just say change this to Mary Kelly, that the original data plus the delta itself has also been added. I can also go through, if I'm looking at remote data, and I can merge that data and then also commit updates as well. And if I go back into my database tab here, if I go through and add user data, let's just use change views, go ahead and commit that. You can now see that the data itself was actually changed even from the server. So if we go through and close out this application and then reopen the application, we can open that DB connection and see that the changes are still here. Now the benefits of using change views as an Interbase VAR is that you have a cost-effective and fast method to keep data updated with the changes only. You have a clear way to present that data to your end users using notifications on changes or updates out in the field or changes made by the server. And as an Interbase VAR, change views provides you with more flexibility across your platforms, better data transmission performance, real-time event alerts, and lower network traffic and costs associated with moving data. Now that we've seen a few applications and know how to get and use the to-go licenses, let's talk about the deployment requirements for both desktop and mobile. With desktop deployments, you need the client libraries. For Win32, you need the GDS32 DLL. 64, you need the IB client 64. Mac uses the dylib, and Linux installs use the SO client. So in Rad Studio, you'll go to Project Deployment, which is the second option from the bottom, and then Add Featured Files. There you'll see the Interbase client libraries that can be added to your project in preparation for deployment. The biggest difference between the client server type with Windows or Mac, for instance, and the embedded Interbase to go is really the number of files that you need to deploy with. You'll do the exact same process of project deployment, add featured files, but you'll use the Interbase to go client set rather than the Interbase client. The options that I have here specifically deploy the necessary files for an Interbase to go application. I've chosen the Interbase to go rather than IB Lite, but you can choose either. The only time you won't need to use the admin.ib file in the distribution is if you're using embedded user authentication, which is where the username and the password are actually held within the database for security purposes. On to maintaining Interbase. There's always a few good housekeeping rules to look at when you're working with any database. Now, one of the main benefits to Interbase is that it's kind of one of those databases that once you have what you need set up, you can sort of just relax a little bit. And Interbase has a lot of different ways to help you keep up with database maintenance. You can prepare a database for shutdown, and perform a lot of database maintenance using either the command line utilities or also using IB console. If your database has some minor problem, such as maybe a write error, the tools that you need are built into Interbase to help you fix those. Some other tasks that you typically find as part of your database maintenance plan, things like sweeping the database. You can do that with Interbase without even having to take it offline. Shutting down the database in case you need to provide exclusive access to it. If you need to prepare a corrupt database for a backup, or if you have the need to resolve transactions that are in limbo. A transaction in limbo is basically a transaction that is stuck in the database and it prevents you from making new transactions. And then other things like validating and repairing the database structure. To protect your data and your database from failure, performing backups on a regular basis is a must. There are several performance-related benefits as well to doing even periodic backup and restores of Interbase databases. With increasing your backup performance, you can actually disable the garbage collection if you are just going to replace the database anyway. This can actually make the backup execute faster, and that's just by adding a -G to that backup to disable garbage collection. You can also try backing up to a different disk drive, as that's going to help speed up the process as well. When you're restoring your databases as well, if you're restoring from a different disk drive, that can also help increase performance. And also if you disable your indexes on restore. Now this makes the restore process execute faster, so you'll actually get your database back faster, but you will have to activate the indexes after your restore is complete. Now you can automate this whole process with a batch script, so you just create a batch with the iSQL script title and essentially set all of your indexes to active instead. And if you kind of keep that handy, you can just run it anytime you do a restore. The only downside is that if you do not set the indexes to active and they remain as inactive, you will still have access to the data, but the queries will be a little slower on the table until you actually activate that manually using a script. Managing your server security. Now this is a big one. Interbase maintains a list of the usernames and passwords in a security database, that admin.ib file that ships with every server installation. And that admin.ib file is what allows clients to connect to the Interbase database on a server. Client's username and password has to match with the server's username and password combination for them to be able to access the server and then access subsequently the database. Now, you can add or delete usernames and even change user parameters such as the password and user ID, which can be quite beneficial with keeping up with your database users and making sure that your data is also safe. Now, one thing that I get quite a few questions on is DR plans or disaster recovery plans. So using things like journaling or journal archiving. Now, a journal is basically a file, and a journal file records each database transaction as it occurs. So this means that you have an always up-to-date record of the database and its transactions. So this is sometimes referred to as write-ahead logging, and the journal archives are a directory that contain a full database dump and all of the journals that have been completed since that dump, which means then that you can use a journal archive to recover to the last or the latest transaction that was recorded in the most recently archived journal file. So you can use this as what's known as a point-in-time recovery. So point-in-time recovery uses the kind of internal timestamp that's recorded with each transaction in the file, so that if you need to, you can actually restore or recover your database to a specific point, time, and date. Table spaces. This is a fun one. So an Interbase database can be placed into a single file, or it can have multiple files. And they can span anywhere from 2 terabytes all the way up to 32 terabytes, depending on the page size that you choose. So when you've filled up the database page file for that single file, the logical database pages will actually start to spill into the next database file. It does this on its own. And in previous versions of Interbase, there was no way to assign database objects to a particular file. So you'd have tables that had fragments that were really uncontrolled and spread across all of your database files. Table spaces allow a database object definition to specify a storage location in a particular logical file collection. So this might be you have objects that you use more frequently than others that you want to place on an SSD, while you have others that you'd like to place on a mechanical hard disk. So as a DBA, you can leverage table spaces and the characteristics behind it to optimize the database performance runtime. Now, if you are interested in table spaces, that is available in Interbase 2020. It's not accessible in a previous version of Interbase, so you will have to use Interbase 2020 to be able to access table spaces. Now, this is only a fraction of the number of ways that you can really maintain your Interbase database. There are so many out there. They deserve their own webinar. But it's a good place for you to start when you kind of hit the ground running with Interbase. I wanted to move on to our Q&A and see what questions I can answer for you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Mary, for all that great information to get people up and or hit the ground running with Interbase.
Oh, of course, my pleasure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I know something fairly well, right? And then I watch a webinar like this. I'm like, there was a lot of stuff in here I didn't know yet.
Yeah. That's how I feel when I watch most of your webinars, because there's so many topics out there that you can cover with just about anything. In Interbase, honestly, like I kind of alluded to there, almost every feature kind of deserves its own webinar, because there's so much you can learn, and there's just so much kind of behind the scenes that until you've actually kind of learned it all, it makes it a little bit more difficult to say, oh, well, I know everything. And then you're like, apparently I don't.
Yeah. But actually, it surprises me how often I do a search for something to try and figure something out and find out I did a webinar on the topic. And I'm like, wait, I did a webinar on the topic?
Yeah, I find myself in that situation sometimes as well. I'm like, wait, what? Oh no, I did do this. And then I go and I find it and I'm like, here's the video, by the way.
Yeah. So can you run server from a mobile device?
No. So the server has to be installed on either a Windows machine or a Linux machine. The version that runs on a mobile device is the to-go edition or the Ivy Light edition, and that is sort of a format of Interbase, but it is not a server. So it can connect to a server, but it's not the server.
Now, technically, just because I'm pedantic, you could have a x86 mobile Linux device that you could run server on, but there's not a Linux ARM version of server. I don't believe, is there? Yeah.
Not at this time.
Yeah, not yet. Maybe eventually. Well, I know that there is a a Mac OS ARM version coming and probably a Windows ARM version. So eventually there'll probably be a Linux ARM version.
Yeah.
But
Oh, most definitely. Right.
when server is running, what is the power consumption?
So it kind of depends on what you're actually kind of doing. But I mean, if you're, so I mean, it's hard to quantify exactly what the power consumption will be. Like if you're running a server where it's open 24/7 and you have a lot of kind of client requests, so you have a lot of concurrent connections, it can consume more power. Or if you have a lot of kind of processing, so it's kind of hard to quantify exactly what that is. Like I said, The server itself it doesn't typically require too much power, but each client, for instance, has, kind of a couple kilobytes or maybe kilobytes, that each client possesses of kind of power when they connect to the server. So if you've got, thousands of concurrent users, you might see more to that than otherwise.
So when it comes to writing stored procedures, what language are those written in?
So they're kind of written more or less in SQL. Or, if you had a look in there, you'll also notice like some Delphi kind of stuff in there as well. So there's technically the Interbase stored procedures language is kind of a complete programming language that's for Interbase. It includes things like the SQL data manipulation and stuff like that you'll find. Let's see.
Yeah, I used to do a lot of Oracle, and it had its own language as well, and it's similar to that, I think, but it is, yeah, it's the Interbase stored procedure language.
Yeah.
Interbase to go is a single user database, or can multiple users access the database?
So Interbase to go is specifically designed as a single user database. Now, the database file can be the same database file that you use for every single instance. It can be run on the server. It's a cross-platform database file. So the Interbase to go licenses, though, they're designed to be kind of the standalone one user.
So it's a single concurrent license or single concurrent
Yes.
connection. You couldn't have multiple connections to it.
Yeah, so you can, within your application, so it's tied specifically to a single application. So you can't access Interbase to go outside of an application. For instance, on a mobile device, you don't want access to a database, even just
Right.
the file itself, if it's on a mobile device, because there are security issues that you could end up having because it's so open and free. So Interbase to go is tied to the point that it can only be opened from or accessed from the application that you've kind of embedded the server or the to go license with, so that database file with.
What what are the differences between the IB Lite or the different editions of Interbase, and what are the licensing requirements for each? Or do we have a web page that covers that?
We do have a web page that actually covers that on the embarcadero.com/product/interbase, or even if you go to interbase.com, we finally have our own website. So you can also take a look at that. But essentially the biggest differences between them, IB Lite is essentially a pared down version of IB to go. You have a database file size limit of 100 megabytes. You don't have an access to encryption or change views within that, but you can still use it as a silent installation, and it also comes kind of part of the RAD Studio deployments.
Okay. Yeah, so desktop would be one user on the desktop servers, multiple users to go is the full. Okay, all right, that makes sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where's a good place to find some practical examples for a complete beginner to get started with Interbase?
So I actually recommend our doc wiki. Specifically, Interbase has its own doc wiki site. It's very similar to the RAD Studio one, but there's kind of a getting started tutorial that'll actually step by step show you how to use a lot of the features that I showed you today. Plus, you'll actually be able to kind of see photos rather than just watching through a video and listening to me. So yeah, that quick start guide is probably one of the best examples.
Is the IB to go license for mobile included with the IB server license?
No. So the Interbase to go and the server are actually kind of separate products, as we said. So if you're developing for Interbase to go applications and you want to be able to connect to a backend server, the server would be sold differently, and the to go would be either via your RAD Studio license, or if you're planning on distributing, like if you have end users not within your company that you want to deploy to, you can always talk to us about getting a VAR agreement in place, which just kind of simplifies the distribution of Interbase to go.
Yeah. Now there is the if they buy the RAD Studio Enterprise Architect Edition,
yeah,
that
they
does include
get
some to-go licenses, right?
yes. So it includes Interbase to go for mobile only. So for iOS and Android development, if you're interested in iOS, Android, Mac, Windows, and Linux distributions of using that IB2Go license, then you'll need to talk to us about getting a full-scale license for that.
Okay. And on the interbase.com site, there's some page that describes the difference between IB2Go and SQLite, right?
Yes.
Seems like I remember that being on here someplace. But real quick, what is the advantages of to-go versus SQLite?
Well, so there are quite a few. One is the easy integration with RAD Studio development IDE. So if you are a RAD Studio developer, it's a great thing there. You also have built-in encryption. So instead of, like with SQLite, one of the biggest things is that you have to develop this application, and then if you want to be able to encrypt any of the data, you have to get a third party to do that, or you have to spend a little bit extra money to do that. With Interbase, though, to-go licenses, you have that out of the box. You also have access to those change views that can link to a server. So it's not going to be a question of how do I take the data from one application and be able to sync that somewhere else, maybe halfway across the world, to be able to keep constant with the data. You also, which another big benefit, like I was saying in the webinar, to change views from that perspective is you're not having to, if you want to update your application, you're not sending the entire database all over again. You essentially, can kind of, or if you need to get data from an application, you can essentially just sync the changes back and forth rather than actually have to, kind of go through and require the whole application and then push it back out again, and which can take up a lot of network bandwidth.
Okay. Can I carry out all these functions programmatically in Delphi so I have direct real-time control of Interbase?
With several of them, yes, you can. So once everything's been set up on the server, right, you have access to, like we said, FireDeck, and then Interbase or RAD Studio also has IBX or Interbase Express, and those are another kind of set of component sets. But there's also the Interbase API that gets kind of wrapped up within those that you can then access to be able to have kind of real-time control over your database.
How do you view IB2Go database without IB console?
So if you have the Interbase database, typically the easiest way, well, IB console is really going to be the best way to access anything relating to IB2Go. It's a really small download, and it's basically the developer edition of Interbase that you get with anytime you download the to-go edition trial or have access to it.
If you had a end user that wanted to view their data and they download IB or IB console, or is that something that they're able to download?
Yes, IB console it's like I said, it's kind of the developer edition of Interbase. So it's very easy to download and install that. Now, as long as the database is not using encryption or anything like that, then your users can very easily open up the database and kind of view that at any point in time. If you do have encryption, The only way that they will be able to decrypt that database is if you provide them with a encryption key that actually decrypts the database.
So James is saying, last time I looked, the admin.ib username field had a restriction where the first 32 characters only were significant. Meanwhile, there's this fashion for having email addresses as user IDs, and an email address might be longer than 32 characters. So two different longer than 32 character email addresses might be indistinguishable when logging into Interbase. Is there a way around that?
I will actually have to check. I have not, I usually don't ever recommend I never use email addresses in Interbase for user IDs, but I can definitely look into that and see kind of what our engineering team has to say.
The good news would be is that if you're all in the same company, then the most significant bytes of an email address are the first ones. So the rest, the insignificant ones, the .com would be what's chopped off. That's interesting question.
Yeah, definitely.
So I do have a hard stop here, so I'm going to go ahead and if you want to just type some of the answers in here, we'll probably just have to call it at this point, although there's lots of great questions. Sorry to, what integration, import, export tools does Interbase include? For example, migrating from SQL Server or Oracle to Interbase.
So Interbase again, kind of in IB console and in the command line, you can, we actually have an import export tool specifically for data. There are other free tools that are out there that you can also check out. I've done some webinars in the past on kind of importing tables and data from like Paradox and things like that. But there's a lot of products that are out there. Spectral has one. IB Data Pump is also a good product that I tend to use. So Interbase has its own import and export tools for data specifically, but if you're looking for kind of the structure, you'll want to reverse engineer and then forward engineer into Interbase and then pump that data.
Yeah, so there's a question here about licensing. So they probably need to talk to somebody specifically, but if they have Enterprise Edition and they put an app in the App Store using IB2Go, does that cover all the installations of IB2Go, or do they need to have a different license for that?
So as long as it's only for mobile development or mobile deployment, then so iOS and Android, it's royalty free. So you have everything you need for an iPhone. Linux, you'll need to contact us, but for an iPhone or for Android, then you're fine with that.
So Enterprise, the licensing included with Rad Studio Enterprise is unlimited IB2Go deployment. Does it include a desktop or server license at all, or?
No, so no, it doesn't include a desktop or server license. If you're interested in that, you'll need to contact your sales representative for your region, and they'll be able to kind of set you up with what you need.
Okay.
Recording in progress.
Now
Sorry,
I know
I had to start my next meeting here.
Oh, that's no problem. I will say I'll be writing up a kind of a blog post as well. And what I'll do is when I get the list of these questions, I will go through and kind of answer some of them as well. So just look out for the blog post, and there should be answers to most of, if not all of these questions within that.
All right, I will put a link in the chat here for the blog site, because I do need to go and start my next meeting here, unfortunately. Yeah. So thanks everybody for joining. Sorry I couldn't get through all the questions here. All right, thanks a lot, Mary, and thanks everybody else. We will see you all on later. See you online again later. Bye.
Bye.